Hello, I'm Ed O'Keefe, CBS News, reporting from the White House after a recent trip to Michigan, where that state's sizable and politically influential Arab American population could swing the 2024 elections. We visited Dearborn, a city with the largest concentration of Arab Americans in the country, and a place to which Arab families continue to immigrate from around the world. How could a suburb of Detroit determine if Michigan's 15 electoral votes swings the battleground state blue or red in 2024? Well, first, we have to account for how people are currently feeling on key aspects that influence presidential races.
Our new CBS News poll says the most important challenge facing the country is inflation, with 7 in 10 Americans disapproving of President Biden's handling of it. Next, immigration at the border. And that issue is keeping a foreign aid package with badly needed support for Ukraine and aid to Israel tied up in Congress. The state of democracy is the third biggest problem in the eyes of Americans. And rounding out the top 4, gun violence. Another problem for which there seems to be little solution or political appetite for legislation that might help fix it. The executive director of our Elections and Surveys Unit, Anthony Salvanto, is here. So, Anthony, Americans say inflation is the top problem, but it's at the lowest level in 2 years. Why is there a disconnect between data and perception?
I think it starts with this larger sense of lost opportunity beyond the immediate, where more people say that they feel worse off than their parents were at their age than better. And that runs counter to what we typically think of as the American dream, right? And it's especially true for millennials, for Gen Xers, for people in that age range where they're in the prime of their working and earning years. And look, for context, this is new. This inflationary period is new for the bulk of them. You have to go back 40 years to find a period in the U.S. where people face these kinds of inflationary pressures at this kind of a rate. So we ask people, okay, put this in context. The U.S. has been through ups and downs before. What's been the most difficult? And the most immediate is right now, is coming out of the pandemic and the economic impact of that, and then this post-pandemic inflationary period. Yes, there's some recency to that, but it just underlines the point of how much people process the economy right now by comparing their lives pre- and post-pandemic. And it's that framing that I think is essential to understanding how they process all of this.
But the White House would argue inflation is headed in the right direction. It is going lower, and they look at that strong jobs number, just like we saw on Friday. So what is it that people need to experience on a personal level? Yeah,
so I ask people directly, what do you take into account when you evaluate these things? And the personal outweighs what we call the macro numbers, the large numbers. Don't discount them, but it's personal experience of the people you know and your friends, even the businesses around your local community. So that's number one. Number two is, look, the rate is slowing, but prices are still high. And so when you ask people, okay, the jobs market is strong, yes, they acknowledge that, but their income isn't keeping up with inflation. And that's that immediate pocketbook impact where you see such big numbers say that.
Because prices are still not back at those pre-pandemic levels.
Right. And when you look at what can be done from there, people say, okay, well, number one, there's no appetite for more rate hikes. And that's important. That's affecting a lot of, especially a lot of young people as well. There's a large sense that they think the president can control inflation. And look, objectively, that may or may not be the case, but it kind of comes with the job, right? They're not certain. In fact, many aren't sure what exactly the White House has done about all of this. And so his handling of inflation in particular remains low.
The president has a lot of foreign policy, national security crises on his desk right now. The Israel-Hamas war is one of them. What is perception of that?
So his handling of the war is negative, and it's gone a little lower, in part because people aren't sure that the steps his administration is taking are bringing the war, helping bring the war to a peaceful resolution, number one. And number two, we've talked a lot about some of the splits within his own party on this, which is always important for a president on foreign policy. There's an increasing number of Democrats who now say they think the president is giving too much support to Israel. So that's important. having said all that, his overall job approval is still both stable and hinges so much more, back to the top of this, on the economy.
Anthony Salvanto, good to have you here.
Thanks, Margaret.
Our thanks to Anthony Salvanto. I also joined Margaret Brennan on Face the Nation. Take a look.
You know, another thing we saw in our polling that Anthony shared was that Americans are disapproving of the president's handling of this crisis in Israel. I know you went out to that key state of Michigan to report on what voters there are thinking.
Yeah.
What did you learn on the ground?
So important, as Anthony pointed out earlier, the war is not necessarily the biggest issue of concern, but it is in parts of Michigan, Dearborn, Michigan especially, largest concentration of Arab American voters in that critical swing state who look at what's happened over the last 60 days and say, I can't vote for him. He's allowed my relatives or my friends' relatives or my friends' neighbors to get killed. How can we possibly support somebody who's allowed so much civilian death? These are people who campaigned against Donald Trump 4 years in 2016 and in 2020, voted for Biden in 2020 because they knew he was a better option. They look at the two of them now, if that is your option next November, and say, we'll just skip that. Why that matters? Small but influential group of voters inside a big county, inside a big swing state that Joe Biden needs to win, that Donald Trump wants to win back. Right. If you start losing those small groups when these elections are being won on the margins, you're in real trouble. So with that context, take a look at what we learned during our recent trip to Dearborn. 23-year-old Adam Abu Salah's concerns about President Biden are an alarm bell for Democrats.
As a community, we're tired of voting for the lesser of two evils.
4 years ago, he campaigned for the president, urging neighbors in predominantly Arab American Dearborn, Michigan, to vote against Donald Trump.
If you were to ask me 2 months ago if I was going to vote for Joe Biden, yeah, I would have held my nose and voted for him.
But as the administration continues standing by Israel's deadly attacks in Gaza,
in November we remember.
Abu Salah says he and his community can no longer stand by the president.
The same way that they're being silent right now in the face of injustices, we're going to be silent in November 2024.
Abdullah Hammoud is Dearborn's first ever Arab American mayor, and he says many here have lost loved ones during the fighting.
What's unfolding overseas, it's not a political crisis and it's not complicated. It's a humanitarian one.
A Democrat, the mayor applauds the president's domestic accomplishments, but is now struggling with his support. If you face the binary choice of re-electing the president or re-electing the former president, what do?
Well, you have an issue where you have both individuals with blood on their hands. One is spewing obviously very hateful rhetoric, but we have a current president whose policies overseas have resulted in the loss of nearly 20,000 Gazans.
Holding Michigan is key to a Biden victory in 2024. 146,000 Muslim Americans voted here in 2020, with nearly 70% nationally going for the president. But Abu Salah warns the anger here could cost the president the election. So then what will people do? Stay home?
No, we're going to go vote, but we're going to keep the top of the ticket empty.
You would skip voting for president in 2024?
Yes.
Even if it meant Donald Trump might win the presidency?
If you were to tell me that my vote would be the vote whether Biden wins in Michigan or not, I will still not vote for Biden.
A Biden campaign spokesperson says that the president continues to work closely and proudly with leaders in the Muslim and Palestinian communities across the country, while the White House says it continues to tirelessly push to ensure that humanitarian aid gets to the, quote, innocent people of Gaza. CBS News political reporter Ali Novello has been following Dearborn voters closely and helped produce those reports from Michigan. She joins me now from Chicago. How you doing, Ali?
I'm good. How are you doing, Ed?
Good. So it's been a few days since we have been in Michigan, and I think part of what we were trying to do with that trip is, in essence, call out something you had seen, especially early on, which was this real alarm bell potentially for Democrats, in that when we're seeing battleground state elections won by just a few thousand votes, maybe 5 figures, low 6 figures, any sign that a large group of people may swing one way or the other is troubling to those that have to organize and prepare for campaigns, because if they can't count on that group of people or most of them voting in your favor, they got to go somewhere else and find a way to turn that out. So tell us first sort of how you came onto this and what that could mean for Michigan as a battleground state in 2024.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, as we saw in 2020, right, Biden won the state of Michigan by about a 3% margin. And after the attacks on October 7th in Israel, we started seeing a rise in, Islamophobia. We saw some violence rise in that community. And so naturally, the question sort of comes about, well, how is this community responding? And are they still supporting the current administration, especially, given how it's handling the current conflict? So, and after the attacks, we've seen a rise in violence and Islamophobia. And, just recently in Plainfield, Illinois, we saw a 6-year-old Palestinian boy who was stabbed to death. Just recently around Thanksgiving, we saw 3 men of Palestinian descent who were shot in Vermont. And so, naturally, we started to interview voters in Michigan, where many Arab Americans live. And we started to ask them whether they still support the president. And for a lot of them, the answer is no, which makes sense given the recent attacks on their community. So that's what we've started to notice. And as a result, Biden's in serious danger of losing the state of Michigan because this population has lost enthusiasm for him.
I was struck, Allie, how people we talked to said, I don't necessarily have somebody I know who was killed in Gaza, but the guy whose store I go to or one of my neighbors has something like 80 relatives who've been either injured or killed. I mean, we're talking significant personal connection to something that for most Americans is a very removed situation. So the real personal anger and fear and concern that these people have is quite real there.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, even just last month, the Council on American Islamic Relations revealed a concerning surge in reported incidents of anti-Arab and anti-Muslim bias. So even if some Arab Americans haven't personally lost family members in the conflict, they have seen a rise in violence against their community, and they've felt it as well. So this is something that's very prevalent right now.
And of course, it comes alongside the anti-Semitism, incidents of anti-Semitism we've seen all over the country. But I think that the Islamophobia that we've seen flare up again reminded a lot of people initially of what happened after 9/11 and the real steps that were taken to ensure that that wouldn't happen in places like Dearborn and across the country. And, I know you felt this. I saw it in as well when you say to these people, we're upset at Joe Biden. Well, okay, you've got a few other options then. You've got Donald Trump, who instituted a ban on people from predominantly Muslim countries, or what came to be known as the Muslim ban. Or you've got a handful of third party or other party contenders who don't really have a shot at. Even Adam said to us when we talked to him there in Dearborn, we're not taking Marianne Williamson or Cornel West or RFK Jr. seriously because we don't have a shot. Okay, fine. Look at that binary choice. Donald Trump or Joe Biden. And repeatedly, what did we hear? They've got blood on their hands. I mean, is there any other group of people you can think of right now who would look at those two options and have such a visceral and a critical response to either of them and just feel compelled to not vote at all, given those options?
Absolutely. I mean, after visiting the Michigan State University campus in late November, I had a chance to chat with some young voters there, and they had very, very strong negative opinions of the Biden administration as well. A lot of them have said that they, along with their peers, do not plan to vote. And their reasoning for that is because, one, they felt as though they've been given a lot of empty promises. In 2020, many of them said that they were voting for Biden not because they were enthusiastic about his candidacy, but more so because they, didn't support Trump and everything he stood for. But, now that the attacks have happened, now that the Israel-Hamas conflict has taken over people's minds, this is for them, for these younger voters, the last straw. They've lost complete support for Biden. At the protest, there were so many signs up that said, no ceasefire, no vote. When I asked them if there was anything that the president could do at this point to sort of redeem himself in their eyes, a lot of them said no. And they just pointed to those empty promises that they've been given by the administration. And for them, there's just no coming back from this. A lot of them are in full support of Palestinians. And despite, Biden's efforts to call for temporary pauses, to send aid into the Gaza Strip, for a lot of them, it's just not enough. And they have, very strong opinions against Biden, despite the fact that it could lead to a win for Trump.
And, at the White House this week, we were struck by the fact that suddenly, even though it was only to a handful of donors without cameras rolling, the president did signal publicly for the first time his concerns with Benjamin Netanyahu, his oversight of the war, and the political situation he faces in Israel, where he's in this conservative coalition government that, in the view of the president, is keeping him from supporting the establishment of a separate Palestinian state, or the so-called two-state solution. We've known that these two men have known each other for 40 plus years, have been contemporaries on the world stage in various roles, now leaders of their two countries in one of the most critical partnerships the United States has around the world. And yet he can feel compelled to throw his old friend under the bus, in essence, or at least start to, and publicly say what administration officials had been saying more privately for the last several weeks. And I can't help but notice, and I'm sure you do too, Allie, that he's suddenly doing this now after our poll, after reporting by CBS, reporting by other outlets, and increased evidence from Michigan and elsewhere across the Democratic Party, that there's a desire for him to be more critical or less supportive of Israel going forward, given the fact that so many people have died needlessly in Gaza.
Yeah, absolutely. That's something we've definitely noticed. I mean, just days after the attack, Biden announced his complete support for Israel, but we've seen people criticize him for being too soft recently. And although he hasn't made any calls for a ceasefire just yet, and he released an op-ed a while ago saying that a ceasefire will not bring peace to the region, so he is against that idea, and that's specifically what Arab Americans have called for. But yeah, he has received a lot of criticism for being too soft in Israel, and it's not surprising that he's sort of changing his tune lately now that people have become more vocal about that. So yeah, that's an interesting observation for sure.
And we'll see whether that changes at all in the coming days. So looking forward, looking into next year, I know you're going to spend a lot of time focused especially on Midwestern battleground states and other issues across the country.
Absolutely, yeah.
Where do you think this Michigan story goes next? Or what will you be looking for to signal whether or not the president will have sufficient support, or whether perhaps Donald Trump's able to win back the Wolverine state?
Well, I would like to see over the course of the election year how people start to respond to the Biden administration when they're sort of confronted with the reality that we could potentially be facing a Biden versus Trump election again. As of right now, we know Trump is leading in the polls, and he is, beating all the other GOP candidates by a lot. That's not a surprise. But I think it's just so early in the election year that people aren't fully realizing that it could end up coming down to Biden versus Trump again. I think right now Biden is in the hot seat, and they're very angry with how he's handling the conflict, right? This is something that's just taking up people's thoughts every day. So, it's possible that over time, once the reality sets in that, it could be Biden versus Trump again, maybe that 2020 attitude could come back in, and people could start to think, well, I'd rather have a Democrat versus a Republican in office, or, maybe they'll have a different line of thinking next year. You never know. But I'm interested to see how the narrative changes over time as the conflict goes on, and perhaps as Biden continues to criticize Netanyahu, which, as we've seen, he started to change his tune in recent days. So interested to see how things develop and how the community responds to that.
All right. Allie Novello, campaign reporter for CBS News. We will do this again soon.
Thanks, Ed. Good talking to you.
That's it for now. Our thanks to Allie Novello and our CBS News team in Michigan. Much more of this to come as Campaign 2024 rolls along. For now, I'm Ed O'Keefe, CBS News at the White House. Slam that subscribe button if you like what you saw. And thanks for watching.